Except for a talk on Egypt and perhaps reincarnation, there can be few matters for those with an esoteric bent that holds more allure than a discussion of the lost continent of Atlantis. Insofar as there is no objective proof of anything in the universe, such as I am delivering a lecture and you are listening, or maybe asleep as the case may be, likewise, there is no absolute certainty that the fabled land of Atlantis ever existed. Cynics within and without the scientific fraternity will scoff at the suggestion of such a possibility, in the same way that many, perhaps still a majority, in the materialistic Western world pour cold water over the concept of reincarnation. Although I suspect there are still somewhere those who cleave to the notion that the Earth was created in the year 4004 BC, I think it was a Tuesday at 9 hours and 4 minutes AM. Through carbon dating and the like, science has demonstrated that the age of our planet and its occupants is much older than previously thought. Through examination of perfectly preserved human remains, many in the Olduvai Gorge of Africa's Rift Valley, archaeologists have concluded that man has walked, or at least crawled, on this planet for getting on 2 million years. Now, this is still some way short of the 18 million plus years ago, when, according to the secret doctrine, our species became human and earthed enough to leave discernible fossils. But equally, quite some improvement over the less than 1 million years generally accepted as the age of man when I was going to school more than 50 years ago. That we have lived before and that we, namely our egos, have occupied bodies resident in what is now a largely submerged landmass. There is mounting evidence, and much of it of a physical, scientific nature. Even 100 years ago, some scientists acknowledged that land now above sea level were previously below the surface, and vice versa. And for example, many of the coral atolls and islets stretching between India and East Africa were merely the tops of remains of a large landmass, which became known as Lemuria, for the fauna common to them all, and which may have joined Africa with India, and even possibly Australia and or present-day Malaysia. Modern geologists believe that the Earth's land energies were once a single mass called Pangaea, from the ancient Greek pan, all or entire, whole, and Gaia, Mother Earth, land. This was a supercontinent that existed during the Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras. Pangaea assembled from earlier continental units approximately 335 million years ago, and it began to break apart about 175 million years ago. The southern half, called Gondwanaland, combined modern South America, Africa, Arabia, India, Australia, and Antarctica. This area replicates much of what's thought to be Lemuria. Now, while you are familiar perhaps with Lemuria, and possibly the semi-mythical land of Kumari Kandam, I wonder if you've heard of the continent of Mauritia. Now, this landmass formed a part of Madagascar and India, and scientists say the rest of the continent is now lying at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, where they reckon it has resided for the past 85 million years. In an article written in February 2017, Alicia McDermott writes in the online newspaper Ancient Origins, scientists have now confirmed that the ancient continental crust beneath the island of Mauritius is a remnant of the breakup of the supercontinent of Gondwana. The location of this continent also pertains to the space of the lost continent of Lemuria, a place frequently connected to the legend of Kumari Kandam by Tamil speakers who have claimed that there was a portion of land that was once ruled by the Pangaea kings and swallowed by the sea. English geologist Philip Sclater in the 19th century was puzzled by the presence of lemur fossils in Madagascar and India, which were not found in mainland Africa and the Middle East. He proposed that Madagascar and India were part of a larger landmass, which he named Lemuria. This new study suggests that Sclater might have been onto something, and Tamil people may have some scientific evidence supporting their ideas. The notion that Pangaea kings of Kumari Kandam were rulers of the whole Indian continent and the Tamil civilization might be the oldest in the world is still open to conjecture. However, the discovery of the continent of Mauritia might give some support to the claims of the Tamil legends of Kumari Kandam. The northern half of what was Pangaea, Laurasia, later divided into North America and Eurasia, thus creating the Atlantic Ocean between them. Atlantis, according to H.P. Blavatsky, is roughly comparable to, although not of the same geological age as the modern concept of Laurasia. And Laurasia Gondwana, the latter was named for the Upper Paleozoic and Mesozoic formations in a region of central India. In The Secret Doctrine, H.P. Blavatsky developed a vast history of humanity, beginning not merely in prehistoric times, but even in pre-physical states of being. Human history during our evolutionary cycle, according to HPB, began in matter far more subtle than we now know and comprises 7 great evolutionary stages, of which we are in the 5th, which began in India about 1 million years ago. Each of the evolutionary stages is associated with a continent or configuration of land masses on the surface of the earth. They begin with humanity in an ethereal or gaseous state, the first 2 so-called root races, and devolve through a gradual coagulation and division into sexes, the third called Lemurian, and then into full physicality with the 4th root race, the Atlantean, and our current Aryan root race. And here are some time scales that might put things into perspective for you. The first root races appeared in the primordial and primary periods, the Lemurians in the secondary period, the so-called Age of Reptiles, and the Atlanteans manifest in the tertiary period, when mammals first make their appearance. As human bodies were not fully materialized, there is no fossil evidence. Blavatsky herself first makes mention of Atlantis and other prehistoric cultures in her classic Isis Unveiled of 1877, and further information on the scheme of evolution from an occult viewpoint was given out in the Mahatma letters to Alfred Percy Sinnett, and this taken even further in Blavatsky's magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine of 1888. So as Tim outlined at the beginning, there are many people and many books which have laid claim to the location of Atlantis. Ever since Plato described his Atlantis, many authors have claimed to have found it. Some say it's in the Atlantic Ocean, with the Azores as its former mountain peaks. Others prefer the Mediterranean. Malta, Crete, Cyprus, Santorini, and even Troy all have their champions. British atollogists find their legacy in Cornwall or the Irish Sea. Germans in the sinking Isle of Heligoland. Swedes, not surprisingly, in Sweden. Some favor the Arctic or the Antarctic, and others turn to the New World, finding Atlantis in Cuba, San Domingo, Central America, Bolivia, and even the American state of Wisconsin. Perhaps it's even easier to say, where has it not been? For H.P. Blavatsky, Atlantis was a much older and larger landmass than the island described by the Greek philosopher Plato. It is more nearly the configuration of landmasses on our planet 5 to 6 million years ago, rather than just a large island, Poseidonus, that disappeared beneath the waves just 11,500 years ago. Most of Atlantis was destroyed 850,000 years ago, leaving just a fragment that finally vanished as recorded by Plato. Blavatsky advises that he was an initiate who was forbidden to tell the whole truth, but rather gave an allegorical take on human history. As Blavatsky says in The Secret Doctrine, Volume 2, pages 760 to 61, aiming more to instruct as a moralist than as a geographer, an ethnologist, or historian, the Greek philosopher merged the history of Atlantis, which covered several million years, into one event he located on a comparatively small island. Yet while the existence of Lemuria tends to be widely accepted, at least amongst naturalists, consideration of the possibility of another landmass centered in the northern Atlantic Ocean attracts little more than derision from men of science in the main. One has to ask, is there perhaps more than a touch of professional jealousy, given that it was a scientist that first proposed the idea of Lemuria? And yet there is no lack of supporting evidence of an archaeological, ethnological, geological, botanical, and biological nature for the existence of a continent now submerged called Atlantis. Blavatsky, again in The Secret Doctrine, speaks of the striking similarity between the flora of Europe and that of the southeastern United States. And I quote, "In the forest of Virginia and Florida, found magnolias, tulip trees, evergreen oaks, and plane trees, which correspond with evergreen tertiary flora, term for term." One has to ask, how was the migration effected if we exclude the theory of an Atlantic continent bridging the ocean between America and Europe? The fact that a large number of these flora only appear east of the Rocky Mountains effectively discounts the theory that plant life found its way to North America by way of Asia and the Aleutian Islands. Fossils found on the eastern coast of South America are nearly identical with the Jurassic fossils of Western Europe and Northern Africa. The geological structure of both coasts is nearly identical. The smaller marine animals dwelling in the more shallow waters of South America, the West African, and the South European coasts is also very great. Such facts should convince naturalists that in distant prehistoric times, there was a continent extending from the coast of Venezuela across the Atlantic Ocean to the Canary Islands and North Africa, and from Newfoundland to the coast of France. Well, startling enough, though the picture provided by fossil remains, even more striking is the marked similarity today of the fauna between the various now isolated Atlantic islands. The specimens of Brazilian fauna resemble those of Western Europe. And a resemblance exists between many of the West African and West Indian animal groups. As Blavatsky says in The Secret Doctrine, it's most probable that necks of land formerly existed knitting Atlantis to South America, somewhere along the mouth of the Amazon, to Africa near Cape de Verde, while a similar point of juncture with Spain is not unlikely, as contended for by Ignatius Donnelly. The fact is, North Africa was, before the elevation of the Sahara and the rupture of the Gibraltar connection, an extension of Spain. Consequently, no difficulty can be raised as to how the migration of the European fauna took place. And as can be deduced from what follows, Atlantis was a continuation of Lemuria.
Are the nice trousers? They fit nice to them.
As Blavatsky tells us, the Atlantean portion of Lemuria was the geological basis of what is known as Atlantis. The latter indeed must be regarded rather as a development of the Atlantic prolongation of Lemuria, rather than as entirely new landmass of land upheaved to meet the special requirements of the fourth root race. In the Mahatma letters, we read, the lost lands of Lemuria perished about 700,000 years ago, before the beginning of the tertiary period.
Not beautiful, but...
And also, I'd like to note that Lemuria can no more be confounded with the Atlantic continent than Europe and America.
Somebody buy us sometimes.
Both sank and were drowned with their high civilizations and gods. Yet between the catastrophes, a short period of about 700,000 years elapsed. Lemuria flourishing and ending her career just about the trifling time before the early part of the Eocene age.
That must be another one. That's what I told you to do.
In his book, The Rise and Fall of Atlantis, John Gordon points out that although nature in the main works slowly and progressively to produce its effects, resulting in gradual coastal erosion and submersion, it does also produce terrifying cataclysms of varying types and force. One of the most devastating characteristics of many of these is the speed and power with which they eventually discharge their accumulated energies. With Blavatsky's scenario, every root race except the first suffered one or more cataclysms. Continents disappeared, new lands appeared, mountain chains rose. As she says in her Secret Doctrine, violent minor cataclysms and colossal earthquakes are recorded in the annals of most nations. Elevation and subsidence of continents is always in progress. The whole coast of South America has been raised up 10 to 15 feet and settled down again in just 60 minutes. Huxley has shown that the British Islands have been 4 times depressed beneath the ocean and subsequently raised again and peopled. And within the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, the shores of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway have risen from 200 to 600 feet. On the other hand, the coast of Greenland is sinking fast. so much so that Greenlander will not build by the shore. John Gordon outlines several examples of cataclysms over the millennia. In the 19th century, Brasseur de Bourbourg translated a part of the Mayan Codex Troano, which spoke of a great cataclysm exactly 8,060 years before the Mayan author's own time. This cataclysm resulted in the deaths of 64 million people after a vast coastal landmass in Central America suddenly sank into the ocean. In Jamaica in 1692, an area of some 1,000 acres of coastal land suddenly disappeared beneath the waves. And 6 decades later in Lisbon, 60,000 people died when a coastal area incorporating the city's docks disappeared in minutes in November 1755. And both calamities occurred during massive earthquakes. Japan has been particularly vulnerable. The earthquake of 1923, measuring 8.3 on the Richter scale, killed around 150,000 people and set off multiple firestorms. An even more powerful earthquake, measuring 9.1, hit Tokyo in 2011, and the quake and ensuing tsunami claimed about 20,000 lives. Just 7 years earlier, the 2004 earthquake in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sumatra, also measuring 9.0, killed over 300,000 people. The main planetary cataclysm of the fourth race cycle seems to have coincided with the fourth Atlantean subrace during the Miocene period some 4.5 million years ago, when the central part of the main Atlantean continent was submerged. The immediate cause of these cataclysms was not outside agency, such as a comet, but changes in the inclination of the Earth's axis. And the final disappearance of the largest continent of Atlantis was an event coincident with the elevation of the Alps. However, it seems to be of a worldwide nature, because Blavatsky mentions that Easter Island was occupied by some Atlanteans who, having escaped from the cataclysm which befell their own land, settled on that remnant of Lemuria, only to perish thereon when destroyed in one day by its volcanic fires and lava. However, these cataclysms lasted for millennia, allowing enough time for the so-called refugees to rebuild their culture on the island, as confirmed by the huge sculpted heads still seen there on Easter Island. Blavatsky says the Eastern Island relics are the most astonishing and eloquent memorials of the primeval giants. One has but to examine the heads of these colossal statues to recognize in them at a glance the features of the type and character attributed to the fourth race giants. As John Gordon reminds us, anthropologist Brasseur de Bourbourg confirms the myths of pre-Mayan Toltec peoples of Central America who speak of a race of giants. Human skeletons 12 feet tall and with 6 toes have been found both in California and Arizona. Giants are to be seen in what might appear to be the definitely later Atlantean type indicated by the huge Olmec statuary in Central America. And several decades before geological science became aware of the fact, Blavatsky wrote of the great and extended planetary cataclysm, which had begun 850,000 years ago and lasted about 150,000 years. The secret doctrine declares that most of the later islander Atlanteans perished in the interval between 850,000 and 700,000 years ago and that the early fifth race were 200,000 years old when the first great island or continent was submerged. After the mid-Atlantean cataclysm of about 4.5 million years ago, there appear to have remained only two large continental islands in possession of the fourth race. Mauritia in the north was very close to the Gulf of Mexico and probably incorporated Bolivia and northern Peru, as well as the whole of Central America and Mexico. Daitya, on the other hand, seemingly included the Azores, the Canaries, and Madeira chains, the Maghreb, and the Iberian Peninsula, as well as possibly southern France, Switzerland, and Italy. These continued in existence for several million years until the next main cataclysm, commencing about 1.5 million years ago. These cataclysms resulted in the general destruction of Mauritia. Daitya survived intact until about 270,000 years ago, when further earthquake and volcanic activity destroyed its center. It appears to have been this which led to the flooding of the Tyrrhenian plain, and as a result, the forced opening of what subsequently became known as the Pillars of Hercules. The pure Atlantean stocks, of which the tall Quaternary cavemen were in part the direct descendants, emigrated into Europe long prior to the glacial period, in fact, as far back as the Pliocene and Miocene times in the Tertiary period. Now, whereas the late Lemurians had apparently developed a quite sophisticated method of vocal communication involving the use of a mixture of vowels and consonants to produce so-called root words, the new Atlantean form of consciousness began to evolve the first proper language. As a linguist who used 30 languages, Charles Berlitz was well qualified to show the startling similarities between pre-classical languages, which could have no contact with each other except as offshoots of some ancient language, or at least related set of languages lost in the mists of time. Berlitz claims that this adds up to a great forgotten ancient megalithic culture centered on the Atlantic area. This had widespread overseas trade, an advanced alphabetical language, sophisticated implements, and probably a large empire. This could not have been later than about 8,000 to 10,000 BC, as most of the finds had been covered by the ocean since that time. Blavatsky stresses the significant link between Atlantis and people living in southwestern Europe, and she quotes the expert Farrar in his Families of Speech. The isolated languages of the Basques have no affinity with the other languages of Europe, but with the Aboriginal languages of the vast opposite continent, America, and those alone. She says Paleolithic European man of the Miocene and Pliocene time was a pure Atlantean. The Basques are, of course, of a much later date than this, but their affinities go far to prove the original extraction of the remote ancestors. She adds there is a mysterious affinity between the Basque tongue and that of the Dravidian races of India. On the archaeological front, Blavatsky tells us that stones have been found in the Canary Islands bearing sculptured symbols similar to those found on the shores of Lake Superior in North America. These findings prompted the scientist Berthollet to suggest the unity of race of the early men of the Canary Islands and America. Professor Ratatius in the Smithsonian report was even more bold, postulating that the American Aboriginal peoples were related to the Guanches of the Canary Islands and to the Atlantic populations of Africa, the Moors, the Tuaregs, and Copts, which have been called Egyptian Atlantidae. Blavatsky asserts that the Guanches of the Canary Islands were lineal descendants of the Atlanteans, and this fact will account for the great stature evidenced by their old skeletons. Tenerife in the Canary Islands is a well-known holiday destination, but I wonder how many tourists are aware of the pyramids there. Who built them and why were they constructed? An article entitled The Mystery of the Guanches and the Pyramids of Tenerife by Steve Andrews in June 2015 on the Ancient Origins website tells us more. The pyramids are to be found near the town of Guimar in the south of the island of Tenerife. They are housed in the ethnographic park, which was set up by the explorer Thor Heyerdahl. The Norwegian adventurer first read about the pyramids in a local Tenerife newspaper in 1990. He ended up visiting the island to see them for himself and was so impressed that he set up home in Guimar, where he lived for the rest of his life. Heyerdahl thought the constructions were similar to other stepped pyramids he had seen on his past travels. He theorized that they had been built at a time when people were traversing the oceans, and that a link existed between the pyramid building cultures of Egypt and those of Central America. He thought it was possible that the Guanches, who lived on Tenerife before the Spanish conquest, might have built the pyramids. Heyerdahl and others observed that the constructions are painstakingly designed with stepped levels and possible alignments made for ceremonial purposes, such as those that could have been carried out at the summer solstice. And in 1991, researchers from the Canary Institute of Astrophysics demonstrated that the long sides of some of the terraces surrounding the pyramids of Guimar mark the direction of winter and summer solstices. One of the pyramids has a set of steps built into it. One suggestion is that this is so the celebrant could ascend the stairs to reach the top level of the pyramid where they would be facing the rising sun. So who were the Guanches? It's never been established how these white-skinned and fair-haired people came to live on these islands close to the coast of North Africa. Anthropologists claim the people descended from the Berbers in North Africa, possibly from Libya. But legends abound that the Guanches had originally been Atlanteans who had survived when Atlantis went under the ocean because they had lived on the mountain peaks we now know as the Canary Islands. And what little we do know of the Guanches is taken from the writings of Spanish chroniclers and various archaeological discoveries. The Guanches were hunter-gatherers who had lived in caves and to have had few tools with no metalwork because they lived on volcanic islands where there were no metal ores. Arcio Santos has written an article for the website atlan.org entitled The Mysterious Origin of the Guanches. He says these mysterious natives of the Canaries were nearly exterminated by the Spanish after they invaded the archipelago at the turn of the 15th century. Until the arrival of the Spanish, the Guanches were prevented from sexually mingling with other races, and so had, until that invasion, preserved their pristine Cro-Magnon traits. And even to this day, the blonde, blue-eyed tall stalk has been preserved in part in some of the individuals on these islands. And this was one of their leaders, Pelicar, the great Guanches. The Guanches mummified their dead. This strange method of disposing of the dead, which the Guanches shared with the Polynesians, the Egyptians, and the Mayas, indicates a close affinity amongst these distant nations. The Guanches also left some sort of alphabetical instructions, which have yet to be studied, along with their pottery and peculiar ruins. In the 19th century, considerable progress was made to find a logical location for a submerged Atlantis by the sea soundings taken by British and American ships, the Challenger and Dolphin. They established that a huge elevation projected from the seafloor of the Atlantic, running some 3,000 miles in length. It extends from a point near the British Isles southwards, curving around Cape de Verde and running in a southeasterly direction along the West African coast. This elevation was 9,000 feet in height and broke above the waves at Ascension Island and the Azores. And in the ocean around the Azores were found the ribs of a former massive piece of land. This massive spine, of course, is known as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Blavatsky tells us that the inequalities, the mountains and valleys of its surface could never have been produced in accordance with any known laws for the deposition of sediment, nor by submarine elevation, but on the contrary, must have been carved by agencies acting above the water level. She confirmed from her own Oriental sources the tradition that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was the central range of mountains of the original ancient continent, which had, however, begun to split up around 850,000 years ago as a result of a complete polar shift, which had taken place at the time. In 1980, Egerton Sykes received from a contact in Eastern Europe several extraordinary photos taken by the Soviet research vessel Akademician Petrovsky. They were allegedly taken near the Ampere and Josephine seamounts off Madeira, a few hundred miles west of Gibraltar. But Sykes believed that they may well have been taken near the Azores. Remember that this was at the height of the Cold War, and the Russians would not have wanted to give away the real possession of their vessels or their real intention. The pictures show a probable artificial structure on a site lost on the surface about 8,000 years ago. Nigel Blair, who has collated an enormous amount of material on the subject in a book entitled The Story of the Planet, believes this is direct evidence not just of the sunken colonies of Atlantis, but of one of the islands, possibly the main islands. Sykes later gave the photos and much information to Charles Berlitz for his book and bequeathed his unique Atlantean library to the Edgar Cayce Foundation. He pointed out that there's a vast untranslated Russian literature on Atlantis, dwarfing anything in the West, and that the Russians have amassed extensive evidence. Interestingly enough, the next most significant and most ancient untranslated literature is in Arabic. Sykes prophesied that evidence of Atlantis would be found in the honeycomb of tunnels underneath the Giza Plateau, which supports the pyramids in Egypt. Possibly the two large underground chambers reportedly discovered in the summer of 1994 and to this day still unopened will reveal something rather dramatic. Now, all have built on Plato's famous dialogues, which were written as historical fact, not mythology. They were based on extensive notes taken down in the 6th century by Solon, the great founding figure of Athenian democracy, who in turn got it from Egyptian priests who were translating from hieroglyphs, even then considered ancient, possibly the Thotic records. The priests pointed out that the movement of the heavenly bodies periodically undergoes changes causing earthly catastrophes. Humanity lapses at these points into barbarity and forgets, amongst other things, the art of writing. There have been many floods, one of which the Athenians remembered. So the story goes, this great flood destroyed Atlantis, which was a great island in the Atlantic or Atlas's ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, i.e. the Straits of Gibraltar. According to Plato's account, around this island there were others, and beyond them, at the limit of the ocean, a great continent. One has to ask, is he not referring to America? The Atlantean Islands were a confederacy with one main king, originally Atlas, hence the name, and 10 kings in all. They had an empire which included much of the Mediterranean shores and invaded Europe. Plato tells us that in a war of wars, the Athenians managed to repel the Atlanteans, but shortly afterwards, a violent earthquake tore the earth asunder, and heavy and lasting rains ensued, taking both Atlanteans and Athenians to their graves. In the Critias, Plato says, at first the Atlanteans were divine and obedient, sober, gentle, and wise, not caring for wealth or luxury. Then this divine quality began to fade and gave pride a place to less mortal qualities, to rather lesser mortal qualities. 9,000 years before Plato, Zeus, king of the gods, wanting to chasten, improve, and punish them, called all the gods together and spoke. And here the Critias stops short. Nigel Blair is convinced that the decision was made to destroy Atlantis. Investigations in the last 40 years by the linguist Charles Berlitz are documented in a book entitled Atlantis, the Lost Continent Revealed. Writing with the help of the experienced diver J. Manson Valentine and British historian Egerton Sykes, who was possibly the best Atlantologist in the UK of the 20th century, Berlitz unearthed some impressive findings. These include profiles of underwater pyramids, the underwater Bimini Road. Berlitz also found submerged megaliths off Venezuela and Morocco, and gigantic holes in the Atlantic seabed where possibly great asteroids had struck. Cores taken from the Azores mid-Atlantic plateau corroborate the conclusions reached by the Challenger and Dolphin expeditions in the 19th century, namely that this plateau was on the surface in so-called recent geological times. Berlitz's investigations also encountered vast overgrown pyramids of undreamt of antiquity in the forests of Brazil, and extraordinary similarities between the widely dispersed legends of those who refounded civilization. Several examples of just how the Atlanteans went off the rails are to be found in the commentaries to the stanzas of Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. We read in stanza 10, shloka 40, the following. Then the fourth became tall with pride. We are the kings, it was said, we are the kings. They took wives fair to look upon, wives from the mindless, the narrow-headed. They bred monsters, wicked demons, male and female. Also Kado or Dakini with little minds. And in commentary 33, we read, many acquired divine, more unlawful knowledge and followed willingly the left path. Thus were the Atlanteans approaching destruction in their term. And finally, in volume 2 of The Secret Doctrine, page 762, Blavatsky tells us they, the sixth subrace of the Atlanteans, used magic incantations even against the sun, failing in which they cursed it. The sorcerers of Thessaly were credited with the calling down of the moon, as Greek history assures us. The Atlanteans of the later period were renowned for their magic powers and wickedness, their ambition and defiance of the gods. Blavatsky reminds us that lunar fires had destroyed the land of their fathers, the Lemurians, and water now threatened the fourth race of Atlanteans. Now, while the Atlanteans managed to develop psychic powers to a much greater extent than present-day mankind, their growth in spiritual terms was no more advanced than ours, and perhaps they were even less evolved than us in that department. The emotional body was where both the Lemurian and Atlantean existence was centered. The faculty of reasoning was certainly only beginning to dawn. Even in our current epoch, we're still engaged in a battle between head and heart, but at least the mind is no longer taking a backseat in the engagement and will in time prevail. But it is a long battle, and we are still having to cope with the results of karma, the law of cause and effect, built up during our own times, many lives indeed that were spent in Atlantis. It is said by the ancients that the Atlanteans went deeper into the physical side of things than was expected or had been hoped for. While the Lemurians, somewhat in ignorance, had mated with the apes, it was in full knowledge that the Atlanteans committed the same transgression. We are given to understand that they operated a much looser moral code on the matter of sexual conduct, and according to Blavatsky, they regularly abused their prowess in the realm of psychic arts, using this knowledge to gain, albeit temporarily, advantage over their fellow man and other sentient beings. It's been suggested that many of the current diseases that inhabit the planet are a direct result of our many excesses materially during Atlantean times. Cancer and arthritis immediately come to mind. Perhaps AIDS should be added to this list. The first two afflictions strike every sector of society, rich, poor, educated, and illiterate alike. And while we may develop medicines that alleviate the pain, there does not appear to be a comprehensive cure in sight. Perhaps we're not looking in the right place, and another cataclysm will be necessary to cleanse the planet and our beings. For in common with the Atlanteans, present-day mankind seems to exist on a diet of non-stop conflict. It's a well-documented fact that in the last 2,000 years, there have been perhaps just 200 years when no nation was at war with another. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Perhaps we need to look into the mirror. Warfare has come a long way since the time of bows and arrows, and fighting in the trenches, typifying the 1418 so-called Great War. We can now destroy enemies from thousands of miles away with guided missiles or drones. But the problem is more insidious than that. Every day, as ordinary citizens, we are gradually killing the planet and indirectly ourselves. Years of unrestricted expulsion of noxious fumes from heavy industry, smokestacks, and more recently from automobile exhausts have gradually punctured that invisible membrane called the ozone layer. This protective shield prevents the most dangerous radiation reaching the surface of the planet. But with each passing year, it is doing its job less effectively. And one rather quick backlash is the huge increase in skin cancer cases, in particular in Australia, over which the ozone layer is very thin. On the question of what our governments and we and business can do, one particular problem all of us need to bear in mind is this problem of plastic and its proliferation virtually everywhere. But of greatest concern, the plastic in our oceans. No end of marine life especially suffers, and many have a gruesome death because of the carelessness of us who dump our discarded plastic bottles. There's no lack of intelligence on the planet to solve the problem. And as 75% of the surface of our planet is comprised of silica, the main ingredient in glass, why do we not replace at least plastic bottles with those of glass? We could solve one very big problem very quickly. Now, most of you have heard about Dolly, the transgenic sheep who died a few years ago. She actually was born, so to speak, on the 5th of July, 1996. She was a female domestic sheep, and she's noteworthy for being the first mammal cloned from an adult somatic cell using the process of nuclear transfer. The cell used as the donor for the cloning of Dolly was taken from a mammary gland, and the production of a healthy clone, therefore, proved that a cell taken from a specific part of the body could recreate a whole individual. After cloning was successfully demonstrated through the production of Dolly, many other large mammals were cloned, including pigs, deer, horses, and bulls. In 2009, scientists in northern Spain announced the cloning of the Pyrenean ibex, a form of wild mountain goat, which was officially declared extinct in 2000. Although the newborn ibex died shortly after birth, it's the first time an extinct animal has been cloned and may open doors for saving endangered and newly extinct species by resurrecting them from frozen tissue. And in January 2019, scientists in China reported the creation of 5 identical cloned gene-edited monkeys using the same cloning technique that was used with 2 people, Zhuangzong and Hua, the first ever cloned monkeys. And this is the same cloning technique used on Dolly, and also the same gene editing CRISPR-Cas9 technique allegedly used in creating the first ever gene modified human babies, Lulu and Nana. The monkey clones are made in order to study several medical diseases. We are very much entering uncharted territory, and one has to ask, are we in danger of creating a modern day Frankenstein monster? And once Pandora's box is open, will we be able to close it? One has to ask, are we not quickly approaching the day, like the Atlanteans, when we are no longer strong enough to say no? We seem to be blinded by the appliance of science, but it is based on purely physical considerations. What we need to apply is the science of spirituality, to steal the thunder of the title of a book by a former General Secretary of the Theosophical Society in England, one Ianthe Hoskins. We need to appreciate that every man is his own absolute lawgiver and is responsible for the actions of himself, his town, his nation, and the global community. we must take to heart the meaning of the first object of the Theosophical Society, which is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity. And we must learn to apply this object in our daily life. To love your neighbor is not a sentimental injunction. It is a demand that you try to understand your brother, irrespective of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, or even age and nationality. Mankind must come to realize the unity of all existence. Unless one has been asleep, one must be aware, and perhaps on a regular basis, in the last year, of a major campaign based around the slogan, Black Lives Matter. But Theosophists might argue quite convincingly that all lives matter. But the young of the world seem to suffer economically disproportionately. When they are urged to save for a pension and end-of-life care, many could quite rightly respond, I will live for today as I struggle to pay my rent, forget about put down a deposit for my own home. And what money will they have to save for later life? Any caring society would address these matters and do something to redistribute the wealth in the world, 90% of which is held by just 10% of the population. And I read recently, apparently a quarter of those in prison in this country, the United Kingdom, had previously been in social care, and a similar proportion of the homeless were also in social care. While we may afford equal rights to fellow humans, how many of us really believe that animals and plants and the mineral kingdom, come to that, deserve any special consideration? While a large number of people in the world at large are vegetarian, in the prosperous West, it is still very much a minority that follow this practice. And even vegetarians, in many cases, cannot remain smug as a good number, myself included, wear leather footwear. How any so-called civilized society can allow experimentation on animals is beyond me. Defenders of the faith would say that we could not have eradicated so many diseases without the vaccinations that resulted from experimentation on animals. A dissenting view would have it that many of the diseases in the past century have disappeared more because of improved sanitation than any such drugs introduced. And we still have to evaluate the damage these vaccinations and inoculations have on the long-term health of the populace. The first axiom of science is that all actions have an equal and opposite reaction. If we simply thought before we spoke or acted, the world would be a better place. As we hear in the ageless wisdom, thoughts are things. And just because you do not commit a capital offense, to harbor murderous thoughts to others is enough to set the ball in motion. Similarly, it has been said that the pen is more powerful than the sword. And while we cannot undo what has gone before, whether in Atlantean or more contemporary times, the present and future is ours. Rather, we should learn from our mistakes and build on our successes, and thus bridge the past with the present and future. The second object of the Theosophical Society is to make a study of comparative religion, science, and philosophy. And the third object is to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. Surely all students of the ageless wisdom should wish to know more about themselves and what makes the universe tick. It is only by acting through knowledge and not what has been referred to as voluntary ignorance can we hope to make a better world for ourselves and all sentient beings. And when we do understand life and its laws, then we can act responsibly and substitute for modern day science this science of spirituality and modify the rudder of progress more towards the middle way. Progress in the spiritual dimension is slow and arduous and full of many setbacks. Obviously, not all is black, nor has it ever been so, either during Atlantis or in our current epoch. And some good news to end. I've recently heard by word of mouth 2 encouraging stories from the food industry. Unilever has announced its intention to only deal with companies that pay their workers a living wage. And Tesco now has a policy to pay farmers a fair amount for their produce. I am sure many other competing companies will be forced to come on board. I know that the owner of the Wetherspoons pub company in Britain was punished by the marketplace a couple of years ago when it announced its determination to pay their workers above inflation pay rises. But the owner of the company replied that if you treat workers properly, they will reward you with loyalty. So spiritual output and treating people fairly don't have to be at loggerheads. And this was very much the way that Henry Ford, the icon in the automobile industry based in Detroit, saw the world when he awarded his employees 100 years ago high salaries. We have much to be grateful for in this world. At least in the West, most of us do not go short of meals or shelter. But what we do suffer from in both the East and the West is what might be called spiritual poverty. There is a yearning amongst most people for meaning in life. For years, such persons gravitated towards Orthodox religion. But since Darwinian times, for many, conventional science has become the new God. But even here, many find the mechanistic view of the universe wanting. Some deeper explanation is needed. This is where theosophy, the perennial philosophy, comes into play. The wisdom religion, or the sacred science as it is also known, is as old as mankind. It explains many of life's most perplexing questions, such as, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? We have all lived before, probably several times in Atlantis, and we shall take on earthly garments again in the future. But it is what we achieve in this life that will determine the sort of future we encounter in the next incarnation. The great American theosophist Joy Mills commented that a member of long standing in her own country once remarked, "Joining the Theosophical Society has changed my life." I think a number of you who have attended theosophical meetings before, and some who are members, might echo those sentiments entirely. Theosophy does change your life. You will never be the same after being touched by its eternal verities. But it's a dead philosophy if we do not put it into practice. Shall we together go into the so-called outside world after this meeting and redouble our efforts to make it a living light in our hearts and to make it known that such a thing as theosophy exists? It is the medicine that the world is crying out for. And just to close, I shall read the Golden Stairs, which is how we open and close our meetings in South Essex here in England. And this was written by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky many years ago. If any of you know it, you can join in with me. A clean life, an open mind, a pure heart, an eager intellect, an unveiled spiritual perception, a brotherliness for all, a readiness to give and receive advice and instruction, a courageous endurance of personal injustice, a brave declaration of principles, a valiant defense of those who are unjustly attacked, a constant eye to the ideal of human progression and perfection, which the sacred science depicts. These are the golden stairs up the steps of which the learner must climb to the temple of divine wisdom.